Hey there, friend. Before we begin tonight's journey, I want you to know that this isn't your typical Sunday school lesson. We're about to explore a part of biblical history that's often whispered about in hushed tones or skipped over entirely during morning sermons. Tonight, we're diving into the real, unvarnished truth about what it meant to be a concubine in biblical times. If this kind of historical storytelling helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all here together, exploring these ancient stories while the modern world sleeps around us. Now, settle in. Pull your blankets a little closer. Let the day's worries fade like incense smoke. Because tonight, we're traveling back through millennia to understand a world so different from ours that it might as well be another planet. A world where survival required strategies that would shock us today, where women navigated systems of power that were both brutal and surprisingly sophisticated. You've probably heard the word concubine before, maybe in passing during a church service or while reading through the genealogies in Genesis. But I'm willing to bet that no one ever really explained what that meant. What these women actually did, how they lived, how they survived, how they carved out spaces of agency in a world that seemed designed to erase them entirely. Here's what's fascinating, and perhaps a little unsettling. The strategies these ancient women used to survive aren't as foreign as we might think. Strip away the Bronze Age setting, the oil lamps and the goat hair tents, and you'll find patterns that echo through history, right into our modern world. The Instagram influencer carefully curating her image, the OnlyFans creator building her brand, the sugar baby navigating complex relationships with wealthy men. All of them, in their own ways, are employing survival tactics that would be deeply familiar to a woman like Hagar or Bilhah, or any of the nameless concubines who populate the pages of ancient scripture. But let's be clear about something from the start. This isn't about judgment. This isn't about moral superiority or looking down on anyone, ancient or modern. This is about understanding, about recognizing that throughout history, women have found ways to survive, to thrive, to accumulate power and security in systems that weren't built for them. And sometimes those methods have involved leveraging their sexuality, their fertility, their ability to provide comfort and companionship to powerful men. The word concubine itself comes from the Latin concubina, meaning she who lies with. But that clinical definition barely scratches the surface of what these relationships actually looked like. In the ancient Near East, a concubine occupied a fascinating middle ground between wife and servant. She wasn't quite property, but she wasn't quite free. She had rights, but they were limited. She had status, but it was precarious. She had power, but it was always borrowed, always dependent on the whims of the man who owned her contract. Think about it this way. If you were a woman in ancient Israel, your options were remarkably limited. You could be a daughter, living under your father's authority until he arranged your marriage. You could be a wife, hopefully to a kind man, but legally still his property. You could be a widow, vulnerable and often destitute unless you had grown sons to protect you. Or you could be a concubine, a role that offered certain advantages alongside obvious disadvantages. The concubine system wasn't unique to Hebrew culture. It existed across the ancient world, from Mesopotamia to Egypt, from Greece to Rome. But the biblical accounts give us some of the most detailed glimpses into how these arrangements actually worked. And what we see is a complex web of relationships that served multiple purposes beyond mere sexual gratification. For wealthy men, concubines were status symbols. They demonstrated prosperity, power, the ability to maintain multiple households. But they were also practical investments. In a world where infant mortality was high and plagues could wipe out entire lineages, having multiple women bearing your children was a form of insurance. The more sons you had, the more secure your legacy became. For women, becoming a concubine could be a path to security that was otherwise unavailable. Consider Hagar, Abraham's concubine. She was initially Sarah's servant, probably acquired during their time in Egypt. But when Sarah couldn't conceive, Hagar was offered a role that elevated her status considerably. Yes, she was still technically property, but she was now the potential mother of Abraham's heir. That came with protection, provision, and a certain amount of respect. But here's where it gets complicated, because these relationships were never simple. They were layered with jealousy, competition, political maneuvering, and genuine affection all tangled together. Sarah's treatment of Hagar shows us the darker side of these arrangements. When Hagar conceived and began to look down on her barren mistress, Sarah dealt with her harshly. The text says, Hagar fled into the wilderness, preferring the dangers of the desert to the cruelty of her mistress. This pattern repeats throughout biblical history. Women using whatever tools they had available to secure their survival, to protect their children, to carve out some small measure of autonomy in a world that offered them precious little. And those tools often involved their sexuality, their fertility, their ability to provide comfort and companionship to powerful men. Now, before we go any further, let's address the elephant in the room. You might be wondering why we're comparing biblical concubines to modern social media personalities. The connection might seem jarring at first, but bear with me. The fundamental dynamics haven't changed as much as we might think. Consider the modern influencer economy. Young women build followings by sharing carefully curated versions of their lives. They monetize their beauty, their personality, their perceived accessibility. They enter into complex relationships with wealthy men who can provide them with luxury lifestyles in exchange for companionship and the social status that comes with being seen with an attractive woman. They navigate jealousy from other women, competition from newer, younger creators, and the constant pressure to maintain their relevance and appeal. The platforms have changed. The technology has evolved. But the underlying transaction remains remarkably similar. Women leveraging their attractiveness and personality to secure financial stability and social status from men who have the resources to provide it. The OnlyFans creator who builds a loyal subscriber base is, in many ways, employing the same fundamental strategy as Bathsheba when she appeared on her rooftop at a time when she knew King David would see her. Both understood that male desire could be transformed into opportunity, that sexuality could be leveraged for security and advancement. This isn't to suggest that these modern women are victims or that their choices are entirely driven by survival needs. Many have genuine agency and make deliberate business decisions. But the underlying dynamics, the way that female sexuality intersects with male power and resources, the delicate balance between autonomy and dependence, these patterns echo across millennia. The biblical concubine system also reveals something important about the nature of patriarchal societies. These weren't systems designed to oppress women out of mere cruelty. They were systems that emerged from practical needs, the need to ensure genetic continuity, to form political alliances, to manage resources and inheritance. But they were systems that inevitably placed women in subordinate positions, forcing them to navigate complex webs of power and dependency. The successful concubine, like the successful modern influencer, had to be strategic. She had to understand her market, so to speak. She had to know how to present herself, how to maintain her appeal, how to handle competition, how to build alliances with other women while still competing with them. She had to be part actress, part diplomat, part entrepreneur. Take Gomer, the wife of the prophet Hosea. While not technically a concubine, her story illustrates the precarious position of women who operated outside traditional marriage arrangements. Gomer was described as a woman of whoredom, and her relationship with Hosea was meant to symbolize Israel's unfaithfulness to God. But look beyond the religious metaphor, and you see a woman trying to survive in a world that offered her limited options. Her whoredom might have been the only way she knew to secure food, shelter, and protection. The text doesn't condemn her for her choices. Instead, it shows God's relentless love pursuing her, buying her back, offering her redemption. It's a story that recognizes the desperation that might drive a woman to such choices while still offering hope for restoration. This brings us to another important point. The biblical narrative doesn't present these women as cautionary tales. They're not held up as examples of what not to do. Instead, they're woven into the fabric of salvation history. Tamar, who disguised herself as a prostitute to secure her future, becomes an ancestor of David and ultimately of Jesus. Rahab, the prostitute who helped the Israelite spies, is remembered as a hero of faith. Bathsheba, despite the questionable circumstances of her relationship with David, becomes the mother of Solomon and another ancestor of the Messiah. The message seems clear. God works through broken systems and complicated relationships to accomplish his purposes. The women who found themselves in these situations weren't discarded or forgotten. They were honored, remembered, their stories preserved for us to learn from. This is perhaps where the comparison to modern social media culture becomes most relevant. We live in an age where women are simultaneously more free than ever before, and yet still constrained by many of the same underlying dynamics that shape the lives of biblical concubines. The platforms have changed, but the fundamental challenge remains. How do you secure your survival and advance your interests in a world where your value is often reduced to your physical appearance and your ability to please men? The Instagram model, who carefully crafts her image, building a brand around her lifestyle and beauty, is employing strategies that would be familiar to any biblical concubine. She's leveraging her assets to build security, to create opportunities, to establish herself in a competitive marketplace. She's navigating the same tensions between autonomy and dependence, between personal agency and market demands. The OnlyFans creator, who builds intimate relationships with subscribers, who provides companionship and fantasy in exchange for financial support, is operating in a space that's not so different from the private chambers of ancient palaces. The dynamics of desire, power, and transaction remain remarkably consistent across cultures and centuries. But here's what's important to understand. These comparisons aren't meant to diminish or judge anyone. They're meant to illuminate the continuity of human experience, to show how women have always found ways to survive and thrive within the constraints of their circumstances. The biblical concubines weren't passive victims any more than modern influencers are. They were women making strategic decisions with the options available to them. As we prepare to dive deeper into specific stories from Scripture, into the lives of women like Keturah and Bilhah and Zilpah, remember that these weren't just names in a genealogy. They were real women with real hopes and fears, real strategies for survival, real relationships with the men in their lives and the children they bore. They were women who found ways to matter in a world that didn't always value them, who carved out spaces of influence and security despite the limitations placed upon them. Tonight, we're going to explore their world with fresh eyes, understanding their choices within their context, while recognizing the echoes of their experiences in our own time. We're going to see how survival strategies developed in Bronze Age tents still play out in modern penthouses and social media platforms. We're going to understand what it really meant to be a concubine in biblical times and why these ancient women might have more in common with today's digital entrepreneurs than we ever imagined. So settle in, dear listener. Let the gentle hum of history wash over you. Let your breathing slow as we prepare to step back through time, to walk in the sandals of women whose names you might know, but whose stories you've never really heard. The night is quiet, the ancient world is waiting, and we're about to discover that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Let's begin with perhaps the most strategic concubine in all of Scripture, though you might not think of her that way. Her name was Keturah, and she entered Abraham's life after Sarah's death. The text is frustratingly brief about her, mentioning only that Abraham took another wife, and that she bore him 6 sons. But that brevity itself tells us something important about how these relationships were viewed and recorded. Keturah wasn't just a replacement for Sarah's companionship. She was a carefully calculated decision by a man who understood that his legacy hung in the balance. Abraham was old, ancient even by the standards of his time, but he still had wealth to manage and a name to preserve. Isaac, his heir through Sarah, was established. But what about the vast herds, the servants, the accumulated riches of a lifetime? Keturah's children would inherit these secondary holdings, creating a network of allied tribes that would extend Abraham's influence long after his death. Think about Keturah's position for a moment. She was entering a household where the previous wife had been legendary, where the son of that wife was the chosen heir, where every conversation would be shadowed by the memory of Sarah's laughter and Sarah's tears. Yet she thrived. She bore 6 sons in rapid succession, creating her own dynasty within Abraham's dynasty. Her descendants would become the Midianites, the Dedanites, traders and merchants who would influence the ancient world for generations. This wasn't accidental. Keturah would have understood exactly what her role was, exactly what was expected of her, and exactly how to leverage her position for maximum advantage. She wasn't just warming an old man's bed. She was building an empire. And in that sense, she has everything in common with the modern influencer who parlays a relationship with a wealthy older man into business opportunities, investment capital, and generational wealth. The parallels are striking when you really examine them. The sugar baby who uses her relationship with a tech billionaire to fund her startup. The Instagram model who leverages her connection with a real estate mogul to launch her own property investment firm. The OnlyFans creator who transforms her subscriber base into a multi-million-dollar media company. These women are following a playbook that Keturah helped write 4,000 years ago. But let's not romanticize it. These arrangements, ancient and modern, come with costs that aren't always visible on the surface. Keturah had to watch her sons receive their inheritance and then be sent away, banished to the east, so they wouldn't compete with Isaac for Abraham's primary legacy. The text says Abraham gave them gifts and sent them away while he was still alive, a diplomatic way of saying they were being eliminated as potential rivals. Imagine being Keturah in that moment. You've spent years building relationships, raising children, creating a place for yourself in this powerful man's world. And then, with a few words and some parting gifts, your sons are exiled. Your grandchildren will grow up knowing they're Abraham's descendants, but also knowing they're not the chosen line. It's a kind of success, but success with sharp edges. Success that comes with permanent separation and loss. The modern equivalent might be the influencer who builds her brand around her relationship with a celebrity, only to watch that relationship end and her access to that world disappear overnight. Or the OnlyFans creator who becomes financially dependent on a particular high-value subscriber, only to have that person move on to someone younger, fresher, more exciting. The security these relationships provide is always temporary, always contingent, always vulnerable to the shifting desires of the men who hold the power. This brings us to one of the most psychologically complex stories in all of Scripture. The tale of Bilhah and Zilpah, the concubines who found themselves at the center of a reproductive competition that would shape the future of Israel. These women weren't just caught between 2 sisters. They were pawns in a game of genetic politics that would determine which tribes would dominate the promised land. Rachel was beautiful but barren. Leah was fertile but unloved. And into this volatile situation came their handmaids, women who would become the mothers of 4 of the 12 tribes of Israel. But let's think about this from Bilhah and Zilpah's perspective. They weren't asked if they wanted to bear children for their mistresses. They weren't consulted about their preferences or their feelings. They were simply handed over to Jacob as surrogates, expected to conceive and deliver, and then step back while other women claimed their children. The text says that when Bilhah conceived, Rachel declared, God has judged me and has also heard my voice and given me a son. Not Bilhah's son, Rachel's son. The biological reality was erased by the social convention. Bilhah was the mother, but she would never be the mother in any way that mattered legally or socially. This erasure of the surrogate's role is something we see echoed in modern reproductive arrangements. The wealthy woman who hires a surrogate to carry her child, the celebrity who uses a gestational carrier to avoid the inconvenience of pregnancy, the couple who contracts with a woman in a developing country to bear their child for a fraction of what it would cost domestically. The technology has evolved, but the underlying dynamic remains the same. Women with resources leveraging the reproductive capacity of women without resources. But here's where the biblical narrative becomes fascinating. Unlike modern surrogacy arrangements, which typically involve complete separation between the surrogate and the child, Bilhah and Zilpah remained in the household. They continued to raise the children they had borne, continued to have relationships with them, continued to influence their development. They were simultaneously mothers and not mothers, present and erased, powerful and powerless. This ambiguous status gave them a unique form of influence. They couldn't claim their children legally, but they could shape their children's understanding of their origins. They could whisper stories, share memories, create bonds that transcended the official family structure. When we read about the later conflicts between the tribes of Israel, we're seeing the long-term consequences of these complex family dynamics playing out across generations. The modern equivalent might be the nanny, who becomes a surrogate mother figure to the children of wealthy families, who provides emotional support and guidance that the biological parents are too busy or too self-absorbed to offer. Or the long-term mistress who becomes a quasi-stepmother to her lover's children, who influences their development in ways that the legal wife never realizes or acknowledges. These relationships exist in the shadows of official family structures, but they're no less real for being unofficial. The children involved often carry the emotional imprint of these relationships throughout their lives, sometimes valuing them more highly than their relationships with their legal parents. But let's dig deeper into the psychology of these arrangements. What did it take for a woman like Bilhah to survive in such a situation? How did she maintain her sense of self while being used as a reproductive vessel? How did she form attachments to children who would never fully belong to her? The answer, I think, lies in understanding that these women developed a kind of emotional compartmentalization that allowed them to function within impossible circumstances. They learned to find meaning and purpose in roles that were inherently dehumanizing. They developed strategies for building influence and security that didn't depend on legal recognition or social status. This is remarkably similar to what we see in modern sex work and relationship-based industries. The escort, who learns to separate her emotional life from her professional life, who finds ways to maintain her dignity and self-worth while providing services that society stigmatizes. The cam girl who creates genuine connections with her audience while maintaining clear boundaries about what is and isn't available. The sugar baby who navigates the complex emotional terrain of a transactional relationship while protecting her own psychological well-being. These women, ancient and modern, have had to develop sophisticated emotional intelligence and strategic thinking skills. They've had to learn to read people, to understand power dynamics, to navigate complex social situations where the rules are often unspoken and constantly shifting. Consider how Bilhah would have had to manage her relationship with Rachel. On one hand, Rachel was her mistress, the woman who owned her and who could make her life miserable if displeased. On the other hand, Rachel was also dependent on Bilhah's reproductive capacity, which gave Bilhah a certain amount of leverage. The successful concubine would have learned to use that leverage carefully to provide what was needed while also protecting her own interests. The text gives us hints about how these relationships actually functioned. When Leah stopped bearing children, she gave her handmaid Zilpah to Jacob, saying, "I will get children by her." The competition between the sisters was being fought on the bodies of their servants, but those servants weren't entirely passive in the process. They would have understood what was happening, would have had their own hopes and fears about the outcomes. Zilpah, like Bilhah, became the mother of two of the tribes of Israel. Her sons, Gad and Asher, would inherit portions of the promised land, would become leaders and warriors and fathers of multitudes. But Zilpah herself would always be remembered primarily as Leah's handmaid, as a footnote to someone else's story. This erasure of the concubine's individual identity is something we see repeated throughout history. The geisha, who becomes known only as the companion of a particular powerful man, the courtesan who is remembered only in relation to her famous lovers, the mistress who is defined entirely by her relationship to the married man she serves. Their own thoughts, feelings, ambitions and achievements become secondary to their function in someone else's narrative. But here's what's important to understand. These women weren't passive victims. They were active participants in systems that offered them limited options, but real opportunities for advancement. They made strategic choices about how to position themselves, how to leverage their assets, how to build security and influence within constrained circumstances. The biblical concubines understood something that modern women in similar situations also understand: that survival often requires adapting to systems you didn't create and can't fundamentally change. It requires finding ways to thrive within structures that weren't designed for your benefit, to accumulate power and security through whatever means are available to you. This is perhaps why these ancient stories continue to resonate today. The platforms have changed, the technology has evolved, but the underlying dynamics remain remarkably consistent. Women continue to navigate the complex intersection of sexuality, power, and survival. They continue to make strategic choices about how to leverage their assets in a world that often reduces their value to their physical appearance and their ability to please men. The Instagram influencer who carefully curates her image, building a brand around her lifestyle and beauty, is employing strategies that would be familiar to any biblical concubine. She's leveraging her assets to build security, to create opportunities, to establish herself in a competitive marketplace. She's navigating the same tensions between autonomy and dependence, between personal agency and market demands. The OnlyFans creator who builds intimate relationships with subscribers, who provides companionship and fantasy in exchange for financial support, is operating in a space that's not so different from the private chambers of ancient palaces. The dynamics of desire, power, and transaction remain remarkably consistent across cultures and centuries. But as we explore these parallels, we must be careful not to oversimplify or judge. These women, ancient and modern, are making complex decisions within the constraints of their circumstances. They're not victims, but they're also not entirely free agents. They're navigating systems that offer them real opportunities alongside real risks, real power alongside real vulnerability. The successful concubine, like the successful modern influencer, had to be strategic. She had to understand her market, so to speak. She had to know how to present herself, how to maintain her appeal, how to handle competition, how to build alliances with other women while still competing with them. She had to be part actress, part diplomat, part entrepreneur. As we continue our journey through these ancient stories, we'll see how these themes play out in the lives of other biblical women, how they navigated the complex world of ancient sexuality and power, and how their strategies for survival continue to echo in our modern world. The night is still young, and there are more stories to tell, more connections to explore, more truths to uncover about what it really meant to be a concubine in biblical times. The story of Tamar reveals perhaps the most audacious survival strategy in all of Scripture. Here was a woman who understood that sometimes the only way to secure your future is to take control of the narrative, even if it means risking everything in the process. Her tale isn't just about deception, It's about a woman who recognized that the system had failed her and decided to game it from the inside. Tamar had been married to Judah's eldest son, who died young and childless. According to the customs of the time, she should have been given to his brother Onan to produce an heir in Er's name. But Onan, in an act of prehistoric birth control, spilled his seed on the ground rather than risk creating a child who wouldn't legally be his own. For this, he too died, leaving Tamar in an impossible position. Judah, now down 2 sons and perhaps suspecting that Tamar was cursed, sent her back to her father's house with a promise that she could marry his youngest son Shelah when he came of age. But years passed. Shelah grew up, and no wedding was arranged. Tamar realized she'd been abandoned, left to wither away as a childless widow with no legal recourse and no future prospects. This is where Tamar's story becomes fascinating from a modern perspective. Rather than accepting her fate, she devised a plan that would have made any contemporary social media strategist proud. She understood that Judah, like many powerful men, had weaknesses that could be exploited. She knew his patterns, his desires, his blind spots, and she used that knowledge to orchestrate one of the most successful honey traps in biblical history. When Judah was traveling to shear his sheep, Tamar positioned herself at a crossroads, disguised as a prostitute. Not just any prostitute, but a temple prostitute, a woman whose services would have been considered sacred, even blessed. She covered her face, chose her location carefully, and waited. When Judah approached her, she didn't just offer her body, she negotiated. She demanded his signet ring, his cord, and his staff as payment, essentially acquiring his entire identity kit as collateral. The parallels to modern digital sex work are striking. The successful OnlyFans creator who builds a brand around mystery and fantasy, who carefully controls her image and her availability, who understands that scarcity creates value. The escort who operates in upscale hotels, who targets wealthy businessmen during their travel, who knows that men away from home are more likely to take risks they wouldn't take in their own communities. Tamar understood something that modern women in similar situations also understand: that male desire makes men vulnerable, and that vulnerability can be transformed into opportunity. She didn't just sleep with Judah, she collected evidence. She created a paper trail, so to speak, that would protect her when the inevitable consequences arose. 3 months later, when Tamar's pregnancy became visible, Judah ordered her to be burned alive for adultery. The hypocrisy is breathtaking, but entirely predictable. The same man who had paid for sex was ready to execute a woman for having it. But Tamar had planned for this moment. She sent Judah his signet, cord, and staff with a message: "I am pregnant by the man who owns these." The confrontation that followed must have been electric. Judah, faced with irrefutable evidence of his own hypocrisy, had no choice but to acknowledge the truth. "She is more righteous than I," he declared, "because I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah." It was a complete reversal of power dynamics, a moment when a supposedly powerless woman held the most powerful man in the region accountable for his failures. This is the dream scenario for any modern woman navigating similar dynamics. The sugar baby who documents her relationship with a married politician, the escort who keeps detailed records of her high-profile clients, the cam girl who maintains evidence of her interactions with wealthy subscribers. These women understand that information is power, that documentation is protection, that the same men who benefit from their services can quickly turn against them if given the opportunity. But Tamar's victory came at a cost that modern women would recognize. She secured her future and the future of her children, but she also ensured that she would forever be known primarily for this one act of deception. Her identity became inseparable from her strategy. She was no longer just Tamar. She was Tamar who tricked Judah, Tamar who played the prostitute, Tamar who got pregnant by her father-in-law. This flattening of identity is something we see constantly in modern media. The Instagram influencer who becomes known only for her relationship with a celebrity, the OnlyFans creator who becomes defined entirely by her most controversial content, the sugar baby whose entire public persona revolves around her lifestyle rather than her other accomplishments or interests. Success in these fields often requires a kind of personal branding that can become a prison, where you're expected to perform a version of yourself that may have little to do with who you actually are. Yet Tamar's story doesn't end with shame or regret. She bore twins, Perez and Zerah, and through Perez, she became an ancestor of King David and ultimately of Jesus himself. Her act of desperation and cunning became part of the messianic lineage, suggesting that God honors the survival strategies of women even when they operate outside conventional moral boundaries. This redemptive element is often missing from modern discussions of sex work and transactional relationships. We tend to see these arrangements as either entirely exploitative or entirely empowering, when the reality is usually much more complex. The biblical narrative suggests that God works through complicated relationships and morally ambiguous situations to accomplish his purposes, that survival strategies born of desperation can still be part of a larger plan. Consider how this might apply to a modern OnlyFans creator who uses her platform to fund her education, eventually becoming a doctor or lawyer or entrepreneur, or the sugar baby who leverages her relationship with a wealthy older man to build investment capital, eventually launching her own successful business. These women are following a trajectory that Tamar would recognize, using whatever tools are available to secure not just immediate survival, but long-term prosperity and legacy. The story of Bathsheba offers another lens through which to examine these dynamics. Unlike Tamar, who initiated her encounter with Judah, Bathsheba's situation appears more ambiguous. The text tells us that King David saw her bathing from his rooftop, was attracted to her beauty, and summoned her to the palace. What happened next changed the course of Israel's history. Traditional interpretations often focus on David's abuse of power, the way he used his position to take what he wanted from a woman who couldn't refuse a king's summons. And there's certainly truth to that reading. But if we look more carefully at the text, we see hints of a more complex dynamic at play. Bathsheba was bathing at a time and place where she could be seen from the royal palace. Some scholars suggest this wasn't accidental, that she was deliberately positioning herself to catch the king's attention. If true, this would make her actions similar to those of a modern Instagram influencer who strategically posts content designed to attract the attention of high-value followers, or a sugar baby who frequents the same upscale establishments as the wealthy men she hopes to meet. The timing is also significant. Bathsheba's husband Uriah was away at war, fighting David's battles in a siege that showed no signs of ending quickly. She was essentially a military widow, temporarily abandoned by a husband who might never return. In such circumstances, catching the king's eye could have seemed like a rational strategy for securing her future. But whether Bathsheba was a victim or a strategist, or some combination of both, her story illustrates the precarious position of women in these systems. Her relationship with David led to pregnancy, which in turn led to the murder of her husband and her elevation to the status of queen. It's a trajectory that would be familiar to any modern woman who has navigated the dangerous waters of relationships with powerful men. The pregnancy created a crisis that David tried to solve through deception and ultimately through violence. When he couldn't convince Uriah to sleep with his wife and claim the child as his own, David arranged for Uriah to be killed in battle. Bathsheba became a widow for real, mourned her husband, and then married the king who had orchestrated his death. This sequence of events reveals something important about the nature of these relationships. The same desire that creates opportunity also creates danger. The king who elevates you can also destroy you. The wealthy man who provides for you can also eliminate you if you become inconvenient. The power dynamic that enables your survival can also threaten your existence. Modern women in similar situations understand these risks intimately. The escort who knows too much about her client's business dealings, the sugar baby who becomes pregnant by a married man, the OnlyFans creator who attracts the obsessive attention of a dangerous subscriber. These women operate in a world where the line between opportunity and threat is often razor thin, but Bathsheba's story also demonstrates the potential for transformation and redemption. Despite the violent circumstances that brought them together, she and David appear to have developed a genuine relationship. She became his favored wife, the mother of his chosen heir, a woman with real influence in the royal court. When David was dying, it was Bathsheba who successfully maneuvered to place her son Solomon on the throne. This evolution from victim or opportunist to genuine partner and power broker is something we see in modern relationships as well. The sugar baby who becomes a trusted advisor to her benefactor, the escort who transitions into a legitimate business partnership with a former client, the OnlyFans creator who parlays her success into mainstream media opportunities. These women demonstrate that transactional relationships can evolve into something more substantial and meaningful. Bathsheba's influence extended far beyond her relationship with David. As the Queen Mother during Solomon's reign, she wielded significant political power. When Adonijah asked to marry David's young concubine Abishag, it was Bathsheba who brought the request to Solomon, and Solomon who recognized the political implications and had Adonijah executed. She had become not just a survivor, but a player in the Game of Thrones. This transformation from concubine to Queen Mother illustrates one of the most important aspects of these relationships, their potential for evolution and growth. The women who thrived in these systems weren't just those who were beautiful or sexually appealing, but those who understood how to leverage their initial advantages into lasting influence and security. The modern equivalent might be the Instagram influencer who uses her platform to launch a successful business empire, the OnlyFans creator who transitions into mainstream entertainment, or the sugar baby who becomes a philanthropist and socialite in her own right. These women understand that physical beauty and sexual appeal are temporary assets, but the connections, skills, and resources they can generate are potentially permanent. This brings us to one of the most overlooked aspects of the biblical concubine system, the economic and political dimensions that went far beyond sexual relationships. These women weren't just providing companionship and bearing children, they were managing households, overseeing servants, conducting business, and forming alliances that could span generations. Consider the concubines of Solomon, who reportedly had 300 of them alongside 700 wives. These weren't just women sitting around waiting for the king's attention. They were running a complex domestic economy, managing international relationships, and raising the next generation of Israel's leadership. Each concubine would have brought her own network of family connections, her own cultural knowledge, her own economic resources. The scale is different, but the dynamics are similar to what we see in modern influencer houses or collaborative OnlyFans arrangements. Women pooling their resources, sharing knowledge and strategies, creating support networks that help them navigate the challenges of their profession. The successful concubine, like the successful modern content creator, understood that collaboration could be more powerful than competition. This collaborative aspect is often missed in discussions of both ancient and modern sex work. We tend to focus on the competition, the jealousy, the drama, but the reality is that these women often developed sophisticated support systems that helped them survive and thrive. They shared information about clients, warned each other about dangerous situations, and created informal networks of mutual aid and protection. The biblical accounts give us glimpses of these relationships. When the Queen of Sheba visited Solomon, she would have interacted not just with the king, but with his entire household of wives and concubines. These women would have been ambassadors of a sort, representing different regions and cultures, facilitating trade relationships and political alliances through their connections and knowledge. In our modern context, we see similar dynamics in the way that successful OnlyFans creators collaborate with each other, sharing subscribers and cross-promoting content, or in the way that sugar babies often work together, sharing information about potential benefactors and warning each other about dangerous situations. These networks of mutual support are crucial for survival in industries that operate outside traditional legal protections. The story of Esther provides another fascinating case study in how a woman could leverage her position as a concubine to achieve remarkable things. Esther was selected for King Ahasuerus's harem through what amounted to an ancient beauty contest, a process that would be familiar to anyone who has followed modern reality television or social media competitions. But Esther's story reveals something important about the intelligence and strategic thinking required to succeed in these positions. She didn't just rely on her beauty. She carefully studied the king's preferences, learned the customs of the court, and built relationships with key figures like Haggai, the keeper of the women. She understood that success required more than just physical attractiveness. It required emotional intelligence, cultural adaptation, and political acumen. When the crisis came, when Haman plotted to destroy the Jewish people, Esther was positioned to act. But her intervention required courage and strategic thinking that went far beyond her role as a concubine. She risked her life to approach the king without being summoned, orchestrated a complex plan to expose Haman's plot, and ultimately saved her people from genocide. This transformation from concubine to hero illustrates the potential that existed within these systems for women who were smart, brave, and strategic enough to seize opportunities when they arose. Esther didn't just survive. She thrived, using her position to achieve something far greater than personal security or advancement. The modern parallels are striking. The OnlyFans creator who uses her platform to raise awareness about social issues, the sugar baby who becomes an advocate for sex worker rights, the escort who transitions into social work or counseling. These women demonstrate that the skills developed in these industries, the ability to read people, to navigate complex social dynamics, to build trust and influence, can be applied to much broader purposes. As we continue to explore these ancient stories, we begin to see patterns that transcend time and culture. The successful concubine, like the successful modern woman operating in similar spaces, had to be adaptive, strategic, and resilient. She had to understand not just how to attract men, but how to maintain their interest, how to navigate competition from other women, how to build security for herself and her children, and how to evolve beyond her initial role when opportunities arose. These were not passive victims, but active participants in complex systems that offered both opportunities and risks. They were entrepreneurs of a sort, leveraging their assets to build security and influence in a world that offered them limited options. Their stories remind us that survival has always required creativity, courage, and strategic thinking, regardless of the century or the culture. The night grows deeper, and there are more stories to explore, more connections to draw between these ancient women and their modern counterparts. But already we can see that the fundamental dynamics haven't changed as much as we might think. Women continue to navigate the intersection of sexuality, power, and survival, continue to find ways to thrive within systems that weren't designed for their benefit, continue to transform temporary advantages into lasting legacies. The biblical concubines weren't just footnotes in their husbands' stories. They were architects of their own destinies, working within the constraints of their time to build something meaningful and lasting. Their strategies for survival, their methods of accumulating influence, their ways of protecting themselves and their children, all of these continue to resonate in our modern world, reminding us that the more things change, the more they stay the same. The story of Gomer offers us perhaps the most psychologically complex portrait of a woman navigating the margins of ancient society. She was the wife of the prophet Hosea, but her story reads less like a traditional marriage and more like a case study in survival sex work. The text describes her as a woman of whoredom, and while this was meant to serve as a metaphor for Israel's unfaithfulness to God, it also gives us a window into the reality of women who operated outside conventional domestic arrangements. Gomer's situation would be immediately recognizable to any modern woman who has used dating apps to find financial support, who has maintained multiple relationships with different men to ensure her security, or who has leveraged her sexuality to survive economic hardship. The text suggests that she repeatedly left Hosea, presumably to return to relationships that provided her with material support or emotional satisfaction that her marriage couldn't offer. What's fascinating is that Hosea kept taking her back, kept pursuing her, kept trying to restore their relationship. This wasn't just religious symbolism, it was a realistic portrayal of how these dynamics actually worked. The men who were involved with women like Gomer weren't just exploiting them. They were often genuinely attached to them, genuinely invested in their well-being, even when the relationships were clearly dysfunctional. This pattern repeats constantly in modern arrangements. The sugar daddy who becomes emotionally attached to his sugar baby, the OnlyFans subscriber who develops genuine feelings for a creator, the client who falls in love with an escort. These relationships may start as transactions, but they often evolve into something more complex, something that blurs the lines between commerce and genuine affection. But Gomer's story also reveals the psychological toll of operating in these spaces. The constant movement between relationships, the need to maintain multiple sources of support, the emotional compartmentalization required to function in transactional relationships while still maintaining the capacity for genuine connection. It's exhausting work, and the text suggests that Gomer struggled with it, that she was caught between competing needs and desires that couldn't be easily reconciled. The modern equivalent might be the cam girl who maintains relationships with dozens of regular clients while also trying to sustain a real romantic relationship in her personal life, or the sugar baby who juggles multiple arrangements while pursuing her education or career goals. These women often describe feeling fragmented, like they're living multiple lives that don't quite fit together. But here's where Gomer's story becomes redemptive. Despite her unfaithfulness, despite her repeated departures, despite the chaos she brought into Hosea's life, she was still loved, still pursued, still offered the possibility of restoration and redemption. The text suggests that God's love for Israel was like Hosea's love for Gomer, relentless and unconditional, despite repeated betrayals. This offers a different perspective on women who work in these industries. Rather than seeing them as damaged goods or cautionary tales, the biblical narrative suggests that they remain worthy of love, worthy of pursuit, worthy of redemption. Their choices may be complicated, their situations may be messy, but their fundamental humanity and dignity remain intact. The story of Rahab takes this theme even further. She was a prostitute living in Jericho when the Israelite spies arrived to scout the city before the conquest. But rather than being marginalized or dismissed because of her profession, she became a crucial ally, a woman whose local knowledge and strategic thinking helped secure Israel's victory. Rahab understood something that modern sex workers also understand, that their work gives them access to information and networks that other women don't have. She knew the mood of the city, the fears of the people, the weaknesses in the defenses. She had clients who were soldiers, merchants, officials. She was plugged into the informal information networks that really ran the city. When the spies needed help, she was positioned to provide it. But she didn't just offer assistance out of kindness. She negotiated. She extracted a promise that she and her family would be spared when the city fell. She was strategic, forward-thinking, determined to use her knowledge and connections to secure her survival and the survival of those she loved. This entrepreneurial mindset is something we see constantly in modern sex work. The escort who builds a client base among business executives and uses the information she gains to make investment decisions. the sugar baby who leverages her relationships with wealthy men to build her own network of business contacts. The OnlyFans creator who uses her platform to launch other ventures, from fashion lines to consulting services. These women understand that their work provides them with unique advantages, unique access, unique insights that can be leveraged for purposes beyond immediate financial gain. They're not just surviving, they're building, creating, expanding their influence and their opportunities. Rahab's story also demonstrates the importance of timing and courage. When the opportunity arose to help the spies, she didn't hesitate. She didn't spend time weighing the risks or seeking guarantees. She recognized the moment for what it was and acted decisively. This kind of quick thinking and calculated risk-taking is essential for success in any industry, but it's particularly crucial in fields where the rules are constantly changing and opportunities can disappear quickly. The result was that Rahab and her family were saved when Jericho fell. But more than that, she was incorporated into the Israelite community, eventually becoming an ancestor of David and Jesus. Her past as a prostitute didn't disqualify her from playing a crucial role in salvation history. Instead, it positioned her to make contributions that other women couldn't have made. This integration into the community is something that modern women in similar situations often struggle with. The stigma attached to sex work can make it difficult to transition into other fields, to build relationships outside the industry, to be accepted in mainstream society. But Rahab's story suggests that these transitions are possible, that women who have worked in these industries can find redemption and acceptance, can build new identities and new lives. The key seems to be demonstrating value beyond sexuality. Rahab's knowledge and courage made her valuable to the Israelite community in ways that had nothing to do with her previous profession. Similarly, modern women who successfully transition out of sex work often do so by leveraging the skills they've developed, the networks they've built, the insights they've gained, to create value in other contexts. This brings us to one of the most important aspects of these ancient stories. They don't present these women as victims to be pitied or villains to be condemned. Instead, they present them as complex human beings, making strategic decisions within the constraints of their circumstances. They're agents of their own destinies, even when their options are limited. The story of the woman at the well in Samaria illustrates this beautifully. She had been married 5 times and was currently living with a man who wasn't her husband. Traditional interpretations often focus on her sexual immorality, but a more careful reading suggests a woman who was doing whatever was necessary to survive in a world that offered few options to women without male protection. Each marriage that ended would have left her more vulnerable, more desperate, more willing to accept arrangements that weren't ideal, but that provided some measure of security. By the time Jesus encountered her, she was living in what we might call a common law marriage, a relationship that provided her with shelter and support, but no legal protection or social respectability. This pattern of serial relationships, of moving from one arrangement to another as circumstances change, is something we see constantly in modern contexts. The sugar baby who cycles through different arrangements as her needs and circumstances evolve. The cam girl who builds relationships with different types of clients as her brand and her goals change. The escort who adapts her services and her client base as she ages and gains experience. These women aren't passive victims of circumstances. They're active participants in their own survival. They're making calculations about risk and reward, about short-term security and long-term goals, about what they're willing to sacrifice and what they're determined to protect. But what makes the Samaritan woman's story particularly powerful is Jesus' response to her. He didn't condemn her choices or shame her for her past. Instead, he engaged with her as an equal, as someone worthy of his time and attention, as someone capable of understanding deep spiritual truths. He saw past her survival strategies to her fundamental humanity and dignity. This kind of acceptance is rare in both ancient and modern contexts. Women who work in these industries often face judgment, stigma, and discrimination that can last long after they've moved on to other pursuits. But Jesus' interaction with the Samaritan woman suggests a different possibility, a world where women are valued for who they are rather than judged for what they've done to survive. The conversation between Jesus and the woman also reveals something important about the nature of these relationships. When Jesus mentioned her multiple marriages and current living situation, she didn't deny it or try to justify it. She simply acknowledged the truth of her circumstances. There's a dignity in that honesty, a refusal to pretend or perform or apologize for choices that were made out of necessity. This kind of honesty is something we see in the most successful modern women working in these industries. They don't waste energy on shame or justification. They understand their circumstances, they make strategic decisions, and they move forward with clarity and purpose. They don't seek validation from people who don't understand their situation, but they also don't internalize the shame that society tries to impose on them. The Samaritan woman's story ends with her becoming an evangelist, someone who brought others to Jesus through her testimony. Her past didn't disqualify her from this role. In some ways, it qualified her. She understood what it meant to be thirsty, to search for something that would satisfy, to move from one source of temporary fulfillment to another. When she found the living water that Jesus offered, she was uniquely positioned to share it with others who were searching for the same thing. This transformation from survival mode to purpose-driven life is something we see in modern women who have successfully navigated these industries. The former escort who becomes a counselor or social worker, the ex-sugar baby who starts a non-profit, the retired cam girl who becomes an advocate for sex worker rights. These women use their experiences, their insights, their hard-won wisdom to help others and to create positive change in the world. But perhaps the most striking thing about all these biblical stories is how they normalize these relationships and survival strategies. They don't present them as aberrations or moral failures, but as part of the human experience, as ways that people have always found to survive and thrive in difficult circumstances. The concubine system wasn't presented as ideal, but it also wasn't presented as evil. It was simply one of the ways that ancient societies organized themselves, one of the ways that people formed relationships and built families and accumulated wealth and power. The women who participated in these systems weren't saints, but they weren't sinners either. They were human beings doing what human beings have always done, adapting to their circumstances and making the best of the options available to them. This matter-of-fact acceptance is something that's often missing from modern discussions of sex work and transactional relationships. We tend to either romanticize these arrangements or demonize them, when the reality is usually much more mundane. They're survival strategies, business decisions, relationship choices that people make based on their circumstances and their goals. The biblical narrative suggests that God works through these complicated relationships and morally ambiguous situations to accomplish His purposes. The genealogies of Jesus include women like Tamar, Rahab, and Bathsheba, women whose stories involve sexuality, deception, and survival strategies that operated outside conventional moral boundaries. Their inclusion in the messianic lineage suggests that God honors the agency and resilience of women, even when their choices don't fit neatly into traditional categories of morality. This is perhaps the most important lesson we can draw from these ancient stories. The women who became concubines, who worked as prostitutes, who leveraged their sexuality for survival and advancement, weren't operating outside of God's plan. They were part of it. Their choices, their strategies, their resilience and creativity and determination, all of these were woven into the fabric of salvation history. The modern women who work in similar industries, who make similar choices, who employ similar strategies, are also part of something larger than themselves. They're not victims to be pitied or villains to be condemned. They're human beings making the best of their circumstances, using whatever tools are available to them to build security and meaning and purpose in their lives. As we continue to explore these connections between ancient and modern survival strategies, we begin to see that the fundamental dynamics of human relationships haven't changed as much as we might think. The platforms have evolved, the technology has advanced, but the underlying needs and desires and strategies remain remarkably consistent across cultures and centuries. The biblical concubines understood something that modern women in similar situations also understand: that survival often requires creativity, that security sometimes demands sacrifice, that power can be accumulated through unexpected channels, and that dignity can be maintained even in the most challenging circumstances. Their stories remind us that women have always found ways to thrive, to build meaningful lives, to create lasting legacies, regardless of the constraints and limitations placed upon them. The night continues, and there are more stories to explore, more connections to draw, more insights to uncover about what it really meant to be a concubine in biblical times, and how those experiences continue to resonate in our modern world. But already we can see that these ancient women were not so different from their modern counterparts, that their strategies for survival and advancement continue to echo through the centuries, reminding us that the human spirit finds a way to flourish even in the most challenging circumstances. The story of Abigail presents us with perhaps the most sophisticated example of a woman who understood how to navigate the treacherous waters between survival and strategy. She was married to Nabal, a man whose name literally meant fool, and who lived up to that designation in every possible way. When David and his men approached Nabal for provisions, having protected his flocks and shepherds in the wilderness, Nabal responded with insults and refusal. But Abigail, hearing of her husband's dangerous stupidity, acted with the kind of swift decisiveness that would make any modern crisis management consultant proud. She gathered provisions, loaded them onto donkeys, and rode out to meet David before he could exact his revenge. When she encountered the future king and his 400 armed men, she didn't just offer food, she offered herself. The text is remarkably direct about this. Abigail prostrated herself before David and said, "Let your servant be a slave to wash the feet of my lord's servants." She was essentially offering to become his concubine, to abandon her marriage and attach herself to a man who clearly had a more promising future than her current husband. It was a calculated risk that paid off magnificently. David was so impressed by her wisdom and beauty that he accepted her gifts and sent her home in peace. But the story doesn't end there. When Abigail told Nabal what had happened, he suffered what the text describes as a heart attack, possibly from rage or fear. 10 days later, he was dead. And David, having heard the news, immediately sent messengers to propose marriage to Abigail. Think about the audacity of this woman's strategy. She had essentially auditioned for the role of David's wife while still married to another man. She had demonstrated her value not just as a beautiful woman, but as an intelligent political operator who could prevent bloodshed and manage complex situations. She had shown that she understood power dynamics, that she could read people and situations, that she could act decisively under pressure. The modern equivalent might be the executive assistant who carefully positions herself to become the CEO's right-hand woman, then his confidant, then his partner. Or the social media manager who leverages her proximity to a powerful influencer to build her own brand and eventually launch her own empire. These women understand that access creates opportunity, that timing is everything, and that sometimes you have to be willing to make bold moves when the moment presents itself. But Abigail's story also reveals something important about the temporary nature of these arrangements. She was successful in her transition from Nabal's wife to David's wife, but David continued to accumulate wives and concubines throughout his reign. Abigail became one of many, her initial special status diluted by the addition of other women who brought their own advantages and attractions. This pattern of diminishing returns is something that modern women in similar situations understand intuitively. The sugar baby, who becomes her benefactor's girlfriend, only to watch him become interested in younger women. The OnlyFans creator, who builds a close relationship with a high-value subscriber. only to see his attention shift to newer creators. The escort who becomes a regular client's exclusive companion, only to be replaced when someone more exciting comes along. The key to long-term success in these arrangements seems to be understanding that your initial advantage is temporary, and using that temporary advantage to build something more permanent. Abigail bore David a son, Chileab, securing her position in his household and his lineage. She diversified her portfolio, so to speak, moving beyond her role as wife to become a mother, a political advisor, a manager of domestic affairs. This strategy of leveraging temporary advantages into permanent positions is something we see constantly in modern contexts. The Instagram influencer who uses her platform to launch a sustainable business. The cam girl who builds a loyal following and then transitions into other forms of entertainment or entrepreneurship. The sugar baby who uses her relationship with a wealthy man to build investment capital and eventually achieves financial independence. These women understand that physical beauty and sexual appeal are depreciating assets, but the connections, skills, and resources they can generate have the potential to appreciate over time. They're not just living in the moment, they're building for the future, creating something that will outlast their youth and their initial appeal. The story of Abishag the Shunammite illustrates the other side of this equation, the risks that come with being too closely associated with a powerful man's legacy. She was chosen as a companion for the aging King David, selected for her beauty and her ability to provide warmth and comfort to the dying king. But the text is careful to note that David knew her not, meaning that their relationship was never consummated. This detail might seem insignificant, but it had enormous political implications. When David died and Solomon became king, Adonijah, Solomon's half-brother and rival for the throne, asked to marry Abishag. Solomon recognized this request for what it was, an attempt to claim legitimacy through association with David's most intimate companion. He had Adonijah executed for what he saw as a treasonous request. Abishag had become a symbol, a piece of political capital, a woman whose value was entirely tied to her association with a dead king. She had no agency in the decision about her future, no voice in the political calculations that would determine her fate. She was simultaneously valuable and powerless, desired and disposable. This dynamic is something that modern women in similar situations understand all too well. The escort who becomes too closely associated with a high-profile client, making her a liability if their relationship becomes public. The sugar baby who knows too much about her benefactor's business dealings, making her both valuable and dangerous. The OnlyFans creator whose content becomes evidence in a wealthy subscriber's divorce proceedings, making her a target for his legal team. These women learn to navigate the complex terrain between intimacy and distance, between being valuable enough to be worth protecting and not so valuable as to become a threat. They understand that information is power, but that too much information can also be dangerous. They learn to compartmentalize, to maintain boundaries, to protect themselves while still providing what their clients or partners need. The biblical concubines who survived and thrived were those who understood these dynamics, who could read the political and social currents around them and position themselves accordingly. They weren't just beautiful women providing sexual services, they were political operatives, domestic managers, cultural ambassadors, and strategic thinkers. Consider the concubines of Solomon's court, women who came from different nations and brought with them knowledge of different languages, customs, and political systems. They weren't just trophies, they were intelligence assets, women who could provide insights into the cultures and political systems of their home countries. They were living embodiments of Solomon's international influence, walking symbols of the alliances and trade relationships that made Israel wealthy and powerful. The modern equivalent might be the international sugar baby who provides her wealthy benefactor with access to global markets and cultural insights. Or the multilingual escort who serves as a cultural bridge for her international clients. Or the cam girl who builds a following in different countries and can provide market research and cultural intelligence to businesses looking to expand globally. These women understand that their value extends far beyond their physical appearance or sexual availability. They're providing access, insight, cultural competence, and social intelligence that their clients or partners couldn't easily obtain elsewhere. They're not just selling sex, they're selling expertise, access, and understanding. But perhaps the most important lesson we can draw from these biblical stories is that these women were not passive victims of circumstances beyond their control. They were active participants in their own survival, making strategic decisions about how to position themselves, how to leverage their advantages, how to build security and influence within the constraints of their circumstances. The successful biblical concubine understood that her position was inherently temporary and precarious. She might fall out of favor, she might be replaced by a younger woman, she might become a political liability. But she also understood that her position provided her with opportunities that other women didn't have. She had access to powerful men, to valuable information, to economic resources, to social networks that could be leveraged for her own advancement and the advancement of her children. This understanding of both opportunity and risk is something that modern women in similar situations have had to develop as well. The OnlyFans creator who builds a diverse subscriber base to protect against the loss of any single high-value client. The sugar baby who maintains relationships with multiple benefactors to ensure her security if one relationship ends. The escort who develops a reputation for discretion and professionalism that allows her to command premium rates and attract high-quality clients. These women understand that their work requires not just physical attractiveness and sexual availability, but also emotional intelligence, strategic thinking, risk management, and business acumen. They're entrepreneurs operating in a challenging marketplace, building brands and managing relationships and diversifying their income streams. The biblical narratives suggest that God honors this kind of strategic thinking and entrepreneurial spirit, even when it operates outside conventional moral boundaries. The women who became concubines, who worked as prostitutes, who leveraged their sexuality for survival and advancement, weren't punished for their choices. Instead, they were often rewarded, elevated, incorporated into the larger narrative of salvation history. This suggests a different way of thinking about modern women who make similar choices. Rather than seeing them as victims to be pitied or villains to be condemned, we might see them as entrepreneurs to be respected, as strategic thinkers to be admired, as survivors to be honored. Their choices might be unconventional, their methods might be controversial, but their intelligence, their resilience, and their determination to build better lives for themselves and their families are qualities that deserve recognition and respect. The night grows deeper, and the ancient world feels closer now. The distance between biblical times and our modern age somehow diminished. The women we've encountered in these stories, from Keturah to Abigail, from Tamar to Abishag, they're not so different from the women navigating similar challenges today. They face the same fundamental questions. How do you survive in a world that wasn't designed for your benefit? How do you build security and meaning and purpose when your options are limited? How do you maintain your dignity and your agency when you're operating within systems that seek to reduce you to your usefulness to others? The answers they found, the strategies they employed, the risks they took, and the rewards they secured, all of these continue to resonate in our modern world. The platforms have changed, the technology has evolved, but the underlying human dynamics remain remarkably consistent. Women continue to leverage their attractiveness and their sexuality and their emotional intelligence to build security and influence. They continue to navigate the complex terrain between autonomy and dependence, between opportunity and risk, between survival and fulfillment. The biblical concubines were pioneers in many ways, women who carved out spaces of agency and influence in a world that offered them limited options. They were the original influencers, the first sugar babies, the ancient equivalent of OnlyFans creators. They understood that survival required creativity, that security demanded strategy, that power could be accumulated through unexpected channels. Their stories remind us that women have always found ways to thrive, to build meaningful lives, to create lasting legacies, regardless of the constraints and limitations placed upon them. They remind us that the human spirit is remarkably adaptable, that dignity can be maintained even in the most challenging circumstances, that intelligence and determination can transform even the most precarious situations into opportunities for growth and advancement. As we continue our journey through these ancient stories, we begin to see that the fundamental questions haven't changed, even if the contexts have evolved. The biblical concubines face the same challenges that modern women face. How do you build security in an uncertain world? How do you maintain your independence while still forming meaningful relationships? How do you leverage your advantages while protecting yourself from the risks that come with those advantages? The answers they found, the strategies they employed, the lives they built, all of these continue to offer insights and inspiration for women navigating similar challenges today. They remind us that survival is an art form, that strategy is a skill, that resilience is a choice, and that dignity is something that can never be taken away, only given away. The ancient world is still with us, still speaking to us, still offering its wisdom and its warnings. The women who populated that world, who navigated its challenges and seized its opportunities, they're still here too, their voices echoing through the centuries, their strategies still relevant, their courage still inspiring. They remind us that the more things change, the more they stay the same, and that the fundamental human drive to survive and thrive and build something meaningful transcends time and culture and circumstance. But survival in the ancient world came with costs that modern women would recognize intimately. The biblical concubine lived in a state of perpetual performance, always aware that her security depended on maintaining her appeal, her usefulness, her ability to navigate the shifting moods and desires of the men who controlled her fate. She couldn't have bad days, couldn't age ungracefully, couldn't allow personal problems to interfere with her professional obligations. Consider the unnamed concubine in Judges 19, whose story is so disturbing that it's rarely discussed in polite biblical scholarship. She had fled from her master back to her father's house, perhaps seeking refuge from an abusive situation. But when her master came to retrieve her, her own father welcomed him warmly, celebrating his arrival as if his daughter's feelings were irrelevant to the equation. The text doesn't tell us why she fled, but we can imagine. Perhaps he had grown tired of her. Perhaps he had become violent. Perhaps she had simply reached her breaking point with the constant performance that her position required. But her attempt to reclaim her agency, to assert some control over her own life, was ultimately unsuccessful. She was returned to her master like a piece of property that had temporarily gone missing. What happened next is one of the most horrific passages in all of Scripture. When they were threatened by a mob in Gibeah, her master threw her outside to be brutalized by the crowd. She crawled back to the doorstep and died there, her hand reaching toward the door that would never open for her again. Her master found her in the morning, commanded her to get up as if she were merely sleeping, and when she didn't respond, he loaded her body onto his donkey and took her home. There, in an act of unspeakable violence, he dismembered her body and sent the pieces throughout Israel as a call to war. She had no name, no voice, no agency in life, and even in death, she was used as a tool for someone else's political purposes. Her body became a message, her suffering a catalyst for tribal conflict. This story reveals the darkest possible outcome for women in these systems. When their utility ended, when they became inconvenient or burdensome, they could be discarded without consequence. The same men who had once desired them, who had once valued their beauty and their companionship, could abandon them to horrific fates without losing any sleep over it. Modern women in similar situations understand this risk intimately. The sugar baby who becomes too demanding, the OnlyFans creator who gets too old for her audience, the escort who witnesses something she shouldn't have seen. These women operate in a world where their value is constantly assessed and reassessed, where their security depends on their ability to remain useful and non-threatening. The unnamed concubine story serves as a stark reminder that these arrangements, however beneficial they might seem in the short term, are always built on fundamentally unequal power dynamics. The men hold all the cards, make all the rules, and can change those rules at any time. The women, no matter how skilled or strategic they might be, are always vulnerable to the whims and changing desires of their patrons. But even in this darkest of stories, we see something that modern women would recognize. The concubine's attempt to escape, to reclaim her agency, to assert some control over her own life. She may have ultimately failed, but she tried. She refused to accept her situation passively, refused to pretend that her suffering was acceptable just because it was normalized by her society. This impulse toward resistance, towards self-determination, toward refusing to accept unacceptable situations, runs through many of these biblical narratives. The women who succeeded weren't just those who played by the rules. They were those who found ways to bend the rules, to create new possibilities, to transform their circumstances through intelligence and determination. Hagar's story exemplifies this spirit of resistance. When Sarah treated her harshly during her first pregnancy, Hagar fled into the wilderness, choosing the dangers of the desert over the certainty of continued abuse. It was there that she encountered the angel of the Lord, who commanded her to return, but also promised her that her son would become a great nation. Hagar's response to this divine encounter reveals something profound about her character. She named the Lord El Roi, meaning the God who sees me, who sees. In a world where she was invisible, where her thoughts and feelings were considered irrelevant, she had found a God who saw her, who valued her, who made promises to her directly rather than through her master or mistress. This naming of God is significant because it demonstrates Hagar's agency, her refusal to remain passive even in her relationship with the divine. She wasn't just receiving a message, she was participating in a conversation, contributing her own understanding and perspective to the encounter. When Hagar returned to Abraham's household, she wasn't the same woman who had fled. She carried with her the knowledge that God saw her, that her son had a destiny independent of his father's household, that her suffering had been witnessed and would be redeemed. This knowledge gave her strength to endure, to survive, to eventually claim her freedom. Years later, when Isaac was weaned and Sarah again demanded that Hagar and Ishmael be sent away, Hagar was ready. She had been preparing for this moment, had been building toward independence, had been nurturing her son's understanding of his unique calling. When they were cast out into the wilderness, she didn't despair. She fought for their survival, searching for water, calling out to God, refusing to watch her son die. And God responded. He provided water, promised again that Ishmael would become a great nation, and watched over them as they built a new life in the wilderness. Hagar had transformed from a powerless concubine into the matriarch of her own people, the mother of a nation, a woman whose story would be remembered and honored for millennia. This transformation from victim to survivor to leader is something we see in modern women who have successfully navigated similar circumstances. The former escort who becomes an advocate for sex worker rights, the ex-sugar baby who starts a non-profit to help other women transition out of the industry, the retired cam girl who uses her experience to educate young women about the realities of online sex work. These women understand that their experiences, however difficult, have given them unique insights and perspectives that can be valuable to others. They refuse to be defined by their past, but they also refuse to pretend that their past doesn't matter. Instead, they transform their experiences into wisdom, their survival into strength, their pain into purpose. The story of Rizpah offers another example of this transformation. She was a concubine of King Saul, mother to two of his sons. When David became king, and sought to make peace with the Gibeonites, he handed over 7 of Saul's descendants to be executed, including Rizpah's 2 sons. But Rizpah didn't simply accept this injustice quietly. She took sackcloth and spread it on a rock, and there she kept vigil over the bodies of her sons and the other executed men. For months, from the beginning of harvest until the rains came, she protected their bodies from the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. This act of defiance, this refusal to allow her sons to be forgotten or dishonored, eventually reached David's attention. Moved by her dedication, he retrieved the bones of Saul and Jonathan from their burial place and gave all the executed men a proper burial. Rizpah's grief had become a form of protest, her mourning a demand for justice. In our modern context, we might see similar acts of resistance from women who have been marginalized or exploited. The mother who camps outside the courthouse demanding justice for her murdered child, the sex worker who speaks out about violence in the industry despite threats to her safety, the trafficking survivor who risks everything to testify against her abusers. These women understand that sometimes the only power you have is the power to refuse to be silent, to refuse to allow injustice to proceed without witness, to refuse to let those who have been forgotten remain forgotten. They transform their pain into protest, their suffering into advocacy, their personal tragedies into catalysts for change. The biblical narratives suggest that God honors this kind of resistance, this refusal to accept unacceptable circumstances. The women who fought back, who demanded justice, who refused to be silenced, were often the ones who were remembered, whose stories were preserved, whose actions changed the course of history. This brings us back to one of the most important aspects of these ancient stories. They don't present these women as passive victims waiting to be rescued. Instead, they show us women who were active participants in their own liberation, who used whatever tools were available to them to improve their circumstances and protect their children. The concubine system, for all its limitations and dangers, also provided these women with opportunities that might not have existed otherwise. It gave them access to wealth, to power, to information, to networks of influence that could be leveraged for their own advancement. The successful concubine understood how to navigate these systems, how to maximize their advantages while minimizing their risks. But perhaps most importantly, these stories show us that redemption is always possible, that women who have been marginalized or exploited are not damaged goods to be discarded. Instead, they are human beings with dignity and worth, capable of transformation and growth, deserving of respect and honor. The genealogies of Jesus include women like Tamar, who played the prostitute to secure her future, and Rahab, who worked as a prostitute to survive in a hostile world, and Bathsheba, whose relationship with David began under questionable circumstances. These women weren't airbrushed out of salvation history. They were included, honored, remembered as essential parts of the story. This inclusion suggests that God doesn't judge women for the survival strategies they employ in difficult circumstances. Instead, he honors their intelligence, their resilience, their determination to build something meaningful despite the constraints placed upon them. He sees their hearts, their intentions, their struggles, and he values them not for their perfect compliance with social norms, but for their fundamental humanity. This is perhaps the most important message we can draw from these ancient stories. The women who became concubines, who worked as prostitutes, who leveraged their sexuality for survival and advancement, weren't operating outside of God's love and concern. They were precious to him, valued by him, included in his plans for redemption and restoration. The modern women who make similar choices, who employ similar strategies, who navigate similar challenges, are also precious to God. They are not victims to be pitied or villains to be condemned. They are human beings created in his image, deserving of dignity and respect, capable of transformation and growth. As we continue to explore these connections between ancient and modern survival strategies, we begin to see that the fundamental questions haven't changed. How do you build security in an uncertain world? How do you maintain your dignity when society tries to strip it away? How do you create meaning and purpose when your options are limited? The biblical concubines found answers to these questions that are still relevant today. They understood that survival requires creativity, that security demands strategy, that dignity is something that comes from within and cannot be taken away by external circumstances. They showed us that it's possible to thrive even in the most challenging situations, to build meaningful lives even when your options are constrained. Their stories remind us that women have always been survivors, have always found ways to adapt and overcome, have always refused to be defined by their circumstances. They remind us that the human spirit is remarkably resilient, that intelligence and determination can transform even the most precarious situations into opportunities for growth and advancement. The night continues, and the ancient world feels even closer now. The distance between biblical times and our modern age, somehow diminished by these shared experiences of survival and strategy. The women we've encountered in these stories, they're not so different from the women navigating similar challenges today. They face the same fundamental questions, employed similar strategies, and found ways to build meaningful lives despite the constraints placed upon them. Their voices echo through the centuries, reminding us that the more things change, the more they stay the same, and that the fundamental human drive to survive and thrive and build something meaningful transcends time and culture and circumstance. They remind us that dignity is not dependent on society's approval, that worth is not determined by social status, and that redemption is always possible for those who seek it. The ancient world is still with us, still speaking to us, still offering its wisdom and its warnings. The women who populated that world, who navigated its challenges and seized its opportunities, they're still here too, their strategies still relevant, their courage still inspiring, their stories still unfolding in the lives of women who continue to face similar challenges in our modern world. As the oil lamps flickered in those ancient chambers, casting dancing shadows on mud brick walls, these women understood something that their modern counterparts would recognize immediately. That knowledge is power, but the right kind of knowledge at the right time can be survival itself. The biblical concubine wasn't just warming a bed or bearing children. She was gathering intelligence, building networks, creating a web of relationships that could sustain her long after her physical appeal had faded. Think about the daily reality of a woman like Maacah, one of David's wives, who bore him Absalom. She wasn't just another pretty face in the royal household. She was a princess from Geshur, a small kingdom north of Israel. Her marriage to David was a political alliance, but her real value lay in the information she could provide about the political landscape beyond Israel's borders, the trade routes that connected distant kingdoms, the cultural practices that could be leveraged for diplomatic advantage. The modern equivalent might be the international model who becomes romantically involved with a tech entrepreneur, providing him with insights into global markets and cultural trends that inform his business decisions. Or the multilingual cam girl, who helps her wealthy subscribers understand the social media landscape in different countries, essentially functioning as a cultural consultant wrapped in the package of digital intimacy. These women understand that their value extends far beyond their physical attributes. They're providing access to networks, insights into different social strata, cultural competence that can't be easily acquired through formal education or business channels. They're living bridges between different worlds, different cultures, different ways of thinking and being. But here's where the comparison between ancient and modern becomes particularly striking: the precarious nature of this knowledge-based power. The biblical concubine who knew too much about palace intrigue, who overheard conversations she shouldn't have heard, who understood the implications of political decisions before they were announced publicly, she walked a razor's edge between usefulness and danger. Consider the fate of Bathsheba's first husband, Uriah the Hittite. He was eliminated not because he was a bad soldier or a disloyal subject, but because his very existence threatened to expose David's abuse of power. The knowledge that Bathsheba carried, the truth about her pregnancy and its timing, made her simultaneously valuable and dangerous to the king who had seduced her. This dynamic plays out constantly in modern arrangements. The sugar baby who becomes privy to her benefactor's business dealings, the escort who recognizes her client at a political fundraiser, the OnlyFans creator whose subscriber reveals too much about his personal life during their private conversations. These women learn to navigate the complex terrain between knowing enough to be valuable and knowing so much that they become liabilities. The successful ones develop what we might call selective amnesia, the ability to forget inconvenient truths while remembering useful information. They learn to compartmentalize, to separate what they know from what they can safely act upon, to use their knowledge strategically without overplaying their hand. But perhaps the most sophisticated example of this knowledge-based survival strategy can be found in the story of the Queen of Sheba, who traveled to Jerusalem to test Solomon's wisdom. While not technically a concubine, her interaction with Solomon reveals how intelligent women could leverage their curiosity and knowledge to build relationships with powerful men that transcended simple physical attraction. The Queen of Sheba came to Solomon with hard questions, riddles that tested not just his intelligence, but his understanding of human nature, politics, and the complex dynamics of power. She wasn't seeking to become his wife or concubine. She was establishing herself as his intellectual equal, someone worthy of his respect and attention on grounds that had nothing to do with her physical beauty. Their exchange was essentially a high-stakes intellectual dance, each testing the other's knowledge and understanding, each revealing carefully selected aspects of their wisdom while concealing others. It was diplomacy disguised as flirtation, statecraft wrapped in the language of personal connection. When she left Jerusalem, she took with her not just gifts of gold and spices, but something far more valuable, a trading relationship that would enrich both kingdoms for generations, a diplomatic alliance that would provide security and prosperity for her people, and a reputation for wisdom that would make her legendary throughout the ancient world. The modern equivalent might be the tech entrepreneur who builds a relationship with a venture capitalist not through traditional networking, but through their shared interest in cryptocurrency or artificial intelligence. Or the social media influencer who catches the attention of a media mogul not through her appearance, but through her innovative approach to content creation and audience engagement. These women understand that the most durable relationships are built on mutual respect and shared interests, not just physical attraction or financial transaction. They position themselves as partners rather than possessions, collaborators rather than simply companions. But the Queen of Sheba's story also reveals something important about the limitations of even the most successful of these arrangements. Despite her wisdom, her wealth, her political acumen, she remained an outsider to Solomon's court. She could visit, she could trade, she could even influence policy to some degree, but she couldn't become part of the inner circle, couldn't establish permanent residence in the halls of power. This glass ceiling is something that modern women in similar situations encounter regularly. The sugar baby who becomes a trusted advisor but never quite becomes a legitimate business partner. The escort who develops genuine friendships with her clients but remains excluded from their social circles. The OnlyFans creator who builds a loyal following but struggles to transition into mainstream entertainment or business opportunities. The boundaries are often invisible but always present. Reminders that no matter how intelligent, how valuable, how indispensable these women might become, they're still operating within systems that weren't designed for their full participation. This brings us to one of the most psychologically complex aspects of these arrangements: the constant negotiation between intimacy and distance, between genuine connection and strategic performance. The biblical concubine had to maintain an emotional balance that would be familiar to any modern woman working in these industries. She had to be attractive enough to hold her patron's interest, but not so seductive as to threaten his primary relationships. She had to be knowledgeable enough to provide valuable insights, but not so informed as to become a security risk. She had to be emotionally available enough to provide comfort and companionship, but not so attached as to become possessive or demanding. This emotional tightrope walk required incredible psychological sophistication. The successful concubine developed what we might call professional empathy, the ability to read and respond to her patron's emotional needs, while maintaining enough emotional distance to protect her own psychological well-being. Consider the unnamed concubine who comforted King David in his old age, Abishag the Shunammite. She was chosen specifically for her beauty and her youth, but her real job was to provide warmth and comfort to a dying king. She had to be intimate enough to share his bed, but chaste enough to maintain her technical virginity. She had to be caring enough to provide emotional support, but detached enough to avoid becoming emotionally invested in a relationship that was always temporary. The psychological toll of this kind of emotional labor would be familiar to any modern sex worker or woman in a transactional relationship. The cam girl who performs girlfriend experience for her subscribers, the sugar baby who provides emotional support to a lonely older man, the escort who offers genuine companionship alongside her other services. These women learn to compartmentalize their emotions, to give of themselves without giving themselves away, to provide authentic connection while maintaining professional boundaries. It's exhausting work that requires constant emotional regulation and self-monitoring. But here's what's remarkable about the biblical narratives. They don't judge these women for their emotional strategies. Instead, they present them as intelligent responses to difficult circumstances. The ability to provide comfort without becoming consumed by another person's needs, to offer intimacy without losing oneself in the process. These are presented as skills rather than moral failings. The story of Hagar provides perhaps the most nuanced exploration of these emotional dynamics. Her relationship with Abraham was complicated by her pregnancy, by Sarah's jealousy, by the political implications of her son's birth. But throughout her trials, she maintained her sense of self, her connection to her own identity and purpose. When she fled into the wilderness, she didn't just run away from her problems. She ran toward her own agency, her own relationship with God, her own understanding of her place in the world. The angel who met her there didn't just command her to return. He promised her that her son would become a great nation, that her suffering would be redeemed, that her story would matter. This promise of redemption, of transformation, of meaningful legacy runs through many of these biblical narratives. The women who started as concubines, who worked as prostitutes, who leveraged their sexuality for survival, they weren't doomed to remain frozen in those roles. Instead, they were given opportunities to grow, to change, to become something more than their circumstances had originally allowed. Rahab transformed from a prostitute into a respected member of the Israelite community. Tamar evolved from a desperate widow into an honored ancestor of the messianic line. Bathsheba grew from a woman caught in a compromising situation into a powerful queen mother who shaped the succession of the throne. These transformations weren't just happy accidents. They were the result of these women's refusal to accept limiting definitions of themselves. They understood that their current circumstances didn't define their future possibilities, that their past choices didn't determine their ultimate destiny. This refusal to be defined by their circumstances is something we see in the most successful modern women who have worked in these industries. The former escort who becomes a successful businesswoman, the ex-sugar baby who launches a non-profit organization, the retired cam girl who transitions into mainstream entertainment or technology. These women understand that their experiences, however unconventional, have given them unique skills and perspectives that can be valuable in other contexts. They've learned to read people, to navigate complex social dynamics, to build trust and rapport quickly, to manage their own emotions while responding to others' needs. More importantly, they've learned to separate their actions from their identity, to understand that what they do for survival doesn't define who they are as human beings. They've developed a kind of psychological resilience that allows them to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their core sense of self. The biblical narratives suggest that this kind of resilience, this ability to transform and grow and redefine oneself, is not just admirable, but divinely honored. The women who refused to be limited by their circumstances, who fought for better futures for themselves and their children, who used their intelligence and determination to create opportunities where none existed before. These were the women who were remembered, whose stories were preserved, whose legacies endured. As we near the end of our journey through these ancient stories, we begin to see that the fundamental message hasn't changed across the millennia. Survival requires creativity, security demands strategy, dignity comes from within, and redemption is always possible for those who seek it. The women who became concubines in biblical times weren't so different from the women who navigate similar challenges today. They face the same fundamental questions about how to build security in an uncertain world, how to maintain their dignity when society tried to strip it away, how to create meaning and purpose when their options were limited. The answers they found, the strategies they employed, the lives they built despite the constraints placed upon them, all of these continue to offer insights and inspiration for women facing similar challenges in our modern world. They remind us that the human spirit is remarkably adaptable, that intelligence and determination can transform even the most precarious situations into opportunities for growth and advancement. The biblical concubines were pioneers in many ways. Women who carved out spaces of agency and influence in a world that offered them limited options. They were the original entrepreneurs of survival, the first women to understand that sexuality could be leveraged for security, that beauty could be transformed into power, that intelligence could be converted into influence. Their stories remind us that women have always found ways to thrive, to build meaningful lives, to create lasting legacies, regardless of the constraints and limitations placed upon them. They remind us that dignity is not dependent on society's approval, that worth is not determined by social status, and that redemption is always possible for those who seek it. The ancient world continues to speak to us, continues to offer its wisdom and its warnings. The women who populated that world, who navigated its challenges and seized its opportunities, they're still here too. Their voices echoing through the centuries, their strategies still relevant, their courage still inspiring. As the night grows deeper and the ancient stories blend with modern realities, we can see that the more things change, the more they stay the same. The platforms have evolved, the technology has advanced, but the fundamental human dynamics remain remarkably consistent. Women continue to navigate the complex intersection of sexuality, power, and survival, continue to find ways to build security and meaning within systems that weren't designed for their benefit. The biblical concubines understood something that their modern counterparts also understand, that survival is an art form, that strategy is a skill, that resilience is a choice, and that dignity is something that can never be taken away, only given away. They showed us that it's possible to thrive even in the most challenging situations, to build meaningful lives even when your options are constrained, to create lasting legacies even when your circumstances seem temporary. Their lessons echo through time, reminding us that the human capacity for adaptation, for finding light in darkness, for transforming limitation into opportunity, transcends any single era or culture. The biblical concubines weren't just footnotes in ancient history. They were architects of survival, builders of legacy, women who understood that sometimes the most radical act is simply refusing to disappear. And so, as we prepare to close this chapter of our exploration, let us remember that these ancient women would recognize the world we live in today. They would understand the Instagram model who carefully curates her image to attract high-value followers, the OnlyFans creator who builds genuine connections with her subscribers while maintaining professional boundaries. The sugar baby, who navigates complex relationships with wealthy older men while pursuing her own education and career goals. The tools have changed, but the fundamental challenge remains the same. How do you secure your survival and build your future when the world seems designed to limit your options? How do you maintain your dignity and your sense of self when society tries to reduce you to your utility to others? The biblical concubines found answers to these questions that are still relevant today. They understood that survival requires not just physical beauty or sexual availability, but intelligence, strategic thinking, emotional resilience, and an unshakable belief in their own worth. They showed us that it's possible to work within flawed systems while still maintaining your humanity, to leverage your advantages while still protecting your core identity. Most importantly, they demonstrated that redemption is always possible, that transformation is always available, that the circumstances of your past don't have to define the possibilities of your future. The women who started as concubines could become queens. The women who worked as prostitutes could become heroes of faith. The women who seemed powerless could become ancestors of kings. This promise of transformation, of redemption, of the possibility that your story can change, that your circumstances can improve, that your legacy can outlast your limitations, this is perhaps the most important message we can draw from these ancient narratives. It's a message that speaks directly to modern women who are navigating similar challenges, who are using whatever tools are available to them to build better lives for themselves and their families. The night is quiet now. The ancient stories have been told. The connections have been drawn. The biblical concubines have shared their wisdom across the centuries, their voices joining with the voices of modern women who continue to face similar challenges, who continue to find ways to survive and thrive despite the constraints placed upon them. As you drift off to sleep, perhaps you'll dream of these ancient women, of their courage and their creativity, of their refusal to be defined by their circumstances, of their determination to build something meaningful despite the limitations they faced. Perhaps you'll carry with you their understanding that dignity comes from within, that worth is not determined by social status, that redemption is always possible for those who seek it. The biblical concubines have taught us that survival is an art form, that strategy is a skill, that resilience is a choice. They've shown us that women have always found ways to thrive, to build meaningful lives, to create lasting legacies, regardless of the constraints and limitations placed upon them. Their stories remind us that the human spirit is remarkably adaptable, that intelligence and determination can transform even the most precarious situations into opportunities for growth and advancement. And in the end, perhaps that's the most important lesson of all, that the women who came before us, who faced impossible choices and found ways to survive, who built something meaningful from nothing, who refused to be erased from history, they're still with us. Their wisdom lives on, their strategies continue to inspire, their courage continues to challenge us to be better, to do better, to build better futures for ourselves and for those who will come after us. The ancient world grows quiet now. The oil lamps flicker and fade, but the light these women kindled, the hope they nurtured, the paths they carved through impossible terrain, these remain. Their stories continue. Their voices persist. Their legacy endures. And tomorrow, when you wake to face whatever challenges await you, you'll carry with you the knowledge that you're not alone, that women before you have faced similar trials and found ways to not just survive, but to thrive. And sleep well, dear listener. Dream of courage, of creativity, of the unbreakable human spirit that finds a way to flourish even in the harshest conditions. Dream of the biblical concubines who refused to be forgotten, who transformed their circumstances into opportunities, who built legacies that outlasted empires. And remember that their strength lives on in you. Their wisdom guides you. Their courage inspires you to write your own story of survival and transformation. As the first light of dawn begins to touch the horizon, we find ourselves at the end of this long journey through the shadows of history. The biblical concubines we've encountered tonight, from Keturah to Hagar, from Tamar to Bathsheba, they've shared their secrets across millennia, their strategies echoing in the choices made by women today who navigate similar waters. The Instagram influencer who wakes up each morning to curate her perfect life, the OnlyFans creator who builds intimate connections with strangers across the globe, the sugar baby who balances affection with transaction. They're all walking paths that were carved by women who lived when the world was lit by oil lamps and ruled by kings with absolute power. But here's what strikes me most about these ancient stories, what makes them feel so immediate and relevant despite the centuries that separate us from them. These women weren't victims of their circumstances. They weren't passive players in someone else's game. They were strategists, survivors, architects of their own destinies within the constraints they faced. The biblical concubine understood something that modern women are still learning, that survival requires more than just adapting to the world as it is. Sometimes it requires reshaping that world, one relationship at a time, one strategic decision at a time, one act of courage at a time. When Tamar disguised herself as a prostitute to secure her future, she wasn't just solving an immediate problem. She was rewriting the rules of a system that had abandoned her. When Rahab helped the Israelite spies, she wasn't just choosing sides in a war. She was positioning herself to survive the collapse of her entire world and emerge stronger on the other side. These women understood that power isn't always about holding official positions or commanding armies. Sometimes power is about understanding the desires and weaknesses of those who do hold official power, and leveraging that understanding to create opportunities where none existed before. The modern woman who builds her OnlyFans empire by understanding exactly what her subscribers crave, who creates content that feels intimate and personal while maintaining careful boundaries. She's employing the same fundamental strategy that biblical concubines used to survive and thrive in ancient palaces. The sugar baby who studies her benefactor's business interests and personal insecurities, who positions herself not just as arm candy, but as a trusted confidant and advisor. She's following a playbook that was written by women like Bathsheba and Abigail thousands of years ago. But what makes these comparisons so fascinating isn't just the similarities. It's also the differences, the ways that technology and social change have created new opportunities alongside new challenges. The biblical concubine was limited by geography, by the physical constraints of her world, by the need to be physically present to maintain her relationships. Today's digital entrepreneur can build relationships with wealthy patrons across the globe, can maintain multiple income streams simultaneously, can create content once and monetize it indefinitely. The platforms have evolved, but the fundamental dynamics of desire, power, and transaction remain remarkably consistent. Yet the risks have evolved too. The biblical concubine faced the danger of physical violence, of abandonment, of being cast out into a world that offered few options for women without male protection. The modern woman faces different but equally real dangers. Digital stalking, online harassment, the permanent nature of internet content that can follow her long after she's moved on to other pursuits. The successful women in both eras understood that security comes not from avoiding risk entirely, but from managing risk intelligently. They diversified their relationships, their income sources, their survival strategies. They built networks of support with other women who understood their challenges. They accumulated resources and knowledge and connections that could sustain them beyond their initial advantages. Most importantly, they never lost sight of their ultimate goal. Not just survival, but transformation. The biblical concubines who succeeded weren't content to remain forever in subordinate positions. They used their access to power to build something more permanent, more meaningful, more lasting than their temporary physical appeal. Hagar didn't just survive her exile, she became the matriarch of a great nation. Tamar didn't just secure her immediate future, she became part of the messianic lineage. Rahab didn't just save her own life, she became a hero of faith whose story would inspire generations. The modern women who truly succeed in these industries understand this same principle. They use their platforms not just to generate immediate income, but to build brands, to develop skills, to create networks, to accumulate resources that can be leveraged for entirely different purposes in the future. The OnlyFans creator, who uses her earnings to fund her education, who uses her platform to build an audience for her art, or her writing, or her business ideas, she's following the same trajectory of transformation that characterized the most successful biblical concubines. The sugar baby who studies her benefactor's investment strategies, who builds her own portfolio, who uses her access to wealthy networks to create business opportunities for herself. She's employing the same long-term thinking that allowed women like Keturah and Abigail to secure not just their own futures, but the futures of their children. But perhaps the most important lesson we can draw from these ancient stories is about dignity, about the difference between being reduced to your circumstances and being defined by your response to those circumstances. The biblical concubines who are remembered, who are honored, who are included in the genealogies of kings and prophets, they're not remembered for their perfect compliance with social norms. They're remembered for their intelligence, their courage, their refusal to accept limiting definitions of themselves. The unnamed concubine in Judges who crawled back to the doorstep after being brutalized by a mob. Her story is horrific precisely because it shows us what happens when women have no agency, no power, no ability to protect themselves. But even in that darkest of stories, we see her attempting to return home, attempting to find safety, refusing to simply disappear into the wilderness. The contrast with women like Esther, who used her position to save her people, or Abigail, who prevented a massacre through her quick thinking and diplomatic skills, shows us that the difference between tragedy and triumph often comes down to opportunity, timing, and the courage to act when the moment presents itself. The modern women who work in these industries face similar crossroads, similar moments when they must choose between accepting their circumstances and attempting to transform them. The ones who succeed, who build something lasting, who transition into other fields or create their own empires, they're the ones who understand that their current situation is not their final destination. They're the ones who study, who save, who build, who network, who never stop looking for opportunities to grow beyond their current constraints. They're the ones who understand that dignity comes not from other people's approval, but from their own sense of purpose and self-worth. The biblical narratives suggest that God honors this kind of determination, this refusal to be limited by circumstances, this commitment to growth and transformation. The women who are included in salvation history aren't the ones who played it safe or followed all the rules. They're the ones who took risks, who made difficult choices, who used whatever tools were available to them to build something meaningful. And so, as we reach the end of our journey through these ancient stories, we're left with a message that's both challenging and hopeful. The world hasn't changed as much as we might think. Women still face many of the same fundamental challenges that their ancient sisters faced. The need for security, for dignity, for agency, for the ability to build meaningful lives within systems that weren't designed for their benefit. But the stories also remind us that transformation is always possible, that redemption is always available, that the circumstances of your past don't have to define the possibilities of your future. The biblical concubines, who started with nothing but their beauty, and their intelligence built legacies that outlasted empires. They showed us that it's possible to work within flawed systems while still maintaining your humanity, to leverage your advantages while still protecting your core identity. The modern women, who are navigating similar challenges, who are using whatever tools are available to them to build better lives for themselves and their families. They're carrying forward this same tradition of survival and transformation. They're proving that the human spirit is remarkably adaptable, that intelligence and determination can overcome even the most difficult circumstances. As the night fades and the ancient world grows quiet, we can hear the voices of these women echoing through time, reminding us that courage comes in many forms, that survival is an art form, that dignity is something that can never be taken away, only given away. They remind us that the most important battles are often fought not on public stages, but in private moments, in the quiet decisions we make about who we are and who we want to become. The biblical concubines have shared their wisdom across the centuries. Their strategies still relevant, their courage still inspiring. They've shown us that women have always found ways to thrive, to build meaningful lives, to create lasting legacies, regardless of the constraints and limitations placed upon them. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all, the one that connects these ancient women to their modern counterparts, the one that reminds us that the human story is ultimately about resilience, about the refusal to be defeated by circumstances, about the determination to build something beautiful and meaningful, even in the most challenging conditions. The night is ending now, but the stories continue. The women who came before us, who faced impossible choices and found ways to survive, who built something meaningful from nothing, who refused to be erased from history, they're still with us. Their wisdom lives on, their strategies continue to inspire, their courage continues to challenge us to be better, to do better, to build better futures for ourselves and for those who will come after us. Sleep well, dear listener. Dream of courage, of creativity, of the unbreakable human spirit that finds a way to flourish even in the harshest conditions. Dream of the biblical concubines who refuse to be forgotten, who transformed their circumstances into opportunities, who built legacies that outlasted empires. And remember that their strength lives on in you, their wisdom guides you, their courage inspires you to write your own story of survival and transformation. The ancient world grows quiet now, the stories have been told, but the light these women kindled burns on. Tomorrow, when you wake to face whatever challenges await you, you'll carry with you the knowledge that you're not alone, that women before you have faced similar trials and found ways to not just survive, but to thrive. Their legacy is your inheritance, their courage is your birthright, their wisdom is your guide. Sweet dreams.